never asked to be Spider-Man. I never asked for these powers.
Imagine creating the perfect adaptation of a beloved superhero. You nail the tone, you nail the action. The critics are calling it a masterpiece. The fans are absolutely obsessed, ratings are fantastic, and toys are flying off the shelves. You are exactly where every showrunner dreams to be. And then you get a phone call. Your show isn't just canceled, it is legally wiped off the board. You are forbidden from making another episode, not because people didn't watch it, but because two mega corporations just engaged in a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, and your art got caught in the crossfire. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is exactly what happened to the spectacular Spider-Man. When people ask why this show died, the internet usually points a finger at Disney. But the truth is much darker, far more complicated, and involves a bizarre legal loophole that practically turned Peter Parker into a corporate hostage. Today we are doing a full corporate autopsy on the greatest Spider-Man cartoon ever made. Let's dive in. The year was 2008. Spider-Man 3 had just wrapped up the Sam Raimi trilogy on a highly divisive jazz dancing note. The superhero landscape on television was fine, but scattered. Enter Greg Weisman and Victor Cook. If you know anything about early 2000s animation, Greg Weisman's name carries immense weight. He is the brilliant mind behind Gargoyles and would later create Young Justice. When Weisman and Cook were handed the keys to Spider-Man, they didn't just want to make a cartoon to sell action figures. They wanted to build a definitive, cohesive universe. They operated under a philosophy they called the 5 C's: contemporary, cohesive, coherent, classic, and iconic. Instead of treating the villains like random monsters of the week who just pop out of nowhere, Weisman built a living, breathing ecosystem in New York City. Everything was connected. If you want to understand why this show is considered the gold standard of comic book writing, just look at how they handled the Green Goblin. In almost every other adaptation, the Goblin is just Norman Osborn waking up, putting on a mask, and throwing pumpkins. It's completely predictable. But Weisman treated the audience with respect. He turned the Green Goblin into a season-long murder mystery. Instead of jumping straight to Norman, the show introduces us to the big man of New York's criminal underworld. For weeks, the show heavily implies that the big man is Norman Osborn. But then, in a brilliant twist, Spider-Man finally confronts him, and it's Tombstone.
Surprise, motherfucker!
A cold, calculating, untouchable mob boss operating in plain sight. Tombstone secretly funds the creation of supervillains, like the Sandman and the Rhino, specifically to keep Spider-Man distracted so his illegal operations can run smoothly. Before we get into the absolute legal nightmare of who actually owns this show, if you find it fascinating how billions of dollars in boardrooms dictate the fate of the art we love, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We investigate the business decisions that build and destroy your favorite franchises. It helps the channel out immensely. And right when you think you understand the hierarchy, the Green Goblin shows up. But the Goblin doesn't just attack Spider-Man. He attacks Tombstone. He attacks Oscorp. He is an agent of pure chaos, trying to violently overthrow the established criminal order. The show gives us a dozen red herrings about who is under the mask. By the time the reveal happens at the end of Season 1, it is completely earned. But as brilliant as the Goblin mystery was, it pales in comparison to the emotional devastation of the Venom arc. Most cartoons introduce Eddie Brock purely to become Venom. He shows up, he hates Peter, he gets the alien suit, they fight. Spectacular took a heartbreaking route. They made Peter Parker and Eddie Brock brothers. They bonded over the shared trauma of losing their parents. Eddie is older. He's Peter's mentor. And over the course of 13 agonizing episodes, we are forced to watch that brotherhood decay. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. Eddie sees Peter disappearing, abandoning his friends, keeping secrets. To Eddie, Peter isn't a superhero. He is a selfish kid who only cares about getting photos for the Daily Bugle. By the time Eddie Brock finally bonds with the symbiote, it isn't just a cool comic book moment. It is a tragedy. Venom knows all of Peter's secrets because the symbiote was attached to Peter. But Eddie knows all of Peter's emotional weaknesses because they used to be family. But it wasn't just the villains that made this show a masterpiece. It was how aggressively they grounded Peter Parker. In a lot of adaptations, Peter's financial struggles are just a running joke. He's late for pizza delivery.
Pizza time. You're late.
His landlord yells at him.
So
Sorry, doesn't pay the rent. And don't try to sneak past me.
And that's the end of it. But Spectacular treated poverty with actual weight. Aunt May wasn't just a sweet old lady handing out wheat cakes. She was a widow terrified of losing her house. When Peter gets a job taking pictures for the Daily Bugle, he isn't doing it to buy a car or impress a girl. He is desperately trying to keep the electricity turned on, and the show constantly forces Peter to make impossible choices. Spider-Man's victories always came at the direct expense of Peter Parker's life. And then there is the high school dynamic. Wiseman took characters who were traditionally one-dimensional stereotypes and turned them into real teenagers. Take Flash Thompson. For 40 years of comic history, Flash was just the dumb jock who shoved Peter into lockers. But Spectacular gave him an actual arc. Yes, he bullies Peter. But he is also Spider-Man's most fiercely loyal defender. When the city turns against Spider-Man, Flash is the one standing on the street corner, arguing with adults, defending his hero.
Weak.
Evidence.
Get the bugle! There's no way I'm ever gonna believe Spider-Man's turned to crime!
We actually see Flash struggle with his own identity, his injuries playing football, and his complex respect for Peter's academic brilliance. And we cannot talk about this show without talking about the romance, instead of immediately pairing Peter with Mary Jane or killing off Gwen Stacy for shock value. Gwen wasn't a supermodel. She was Peter's nerdy best friend who harbored a massive, unspoken crush on him. When Mary Jane finally enters the picture with the iconic "Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot" line, she isn't there to steal Peter away. She actually tries to help Peter and Gwen get together. The romantic tension isn't driven by evil ex-girlfriends or contrived misunderstandings. It's driven by the fact that Peter is a teenager with a secret identity, completely terrified of ruining the lives of the people he loves. It was a masterclass in serialized storytelling. But while the writers were building this perfect universe, the corporate foundation beneath them was already fractured, dating back to a financial disaster from over a decade prior. To figure out how Greg Weisman's masterpiece ended up in a legal meat grinder, we have to rewind to December 27th, 1996. This is the day the comic book bubble burst, and Marvel Entertainment Group officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Marvel was bleeding out. The speculator boom of the early 90s, where people bought 5 copies of every comic thinking they'd be millionaires, had completely collapsed. Marvel owed hundreds of millions of dollars. They were desperate for cash just to keep the lights on. So, they started pawning off the film rights to their most iconic characters in what essentially amounted to a corporate fire sale. The X-Men and Fantastic Four went to 20th Century Fox. The Hulk went to Universal. And Spider-Man, the crown jewel of the Marvel Empire, went to Sony Pictures for a mere $7 million. But this wasn't just a standard movie deal. The contract Sony signed with Marvel was an absolute behemoth. Because Marvel was negotiating from a position of total weakness, Sony demanded and received unprecedented control. The contract gave Sony the exclusive rights to make live-action Spider-Man films. But buried in the fine print was a clause that would eventually destroy Spectacular Spider-Man. The contract also gave Sony the rights to produce animated television shows, as long as the episodes were standard television length, over 22 minutes long. If Marvel wanted to make a Spider-Man cartoon, they were legally restricted to making episodes under 22 minutes, or they had to go through Sony. Sony held all the cards. Fast forward to 2008. Sony is riding high off the Sam Raimi trilogy. They look at their contract and realize, hey, we have the rights to make a cartoon. Let's produce it entirely in-house. They created a subsidiary called Culver Entertainment. They hired Greg Weisman. They funded the animation. This is a crucial detail that most people get wrong. The Spectacular Spider-Man was not a Marvel production. It was a Sony production, leased on Marvel's intellectual property. At the time, this felt like the safest bet in the world. Sony had a monopoly on the web-slinger. The executives at Culver Entertainment were so confident that they had tentatively greenlit Greg Weisman for 65 episodes, 5 full seasons, plotting out Peter's entire high school career. The writer's room was already storyboarding season 3. It was a bulletproof plan. Nothing could stop them, except, of course, the largest entertainment monopoly on the planet deciding they wanted their toys back. But believe it or not, that wasn't their biggest problem. The Walt Disney Company announced it was acquiring Marvel Entertainment for $4 billion. Overnight, the entire chessboard flipped. Disney didn't just buy Iron Man and Captain America. They bought the underlying fundamental rights to Spider-Man. Now, Disney knew they couldn't touch the live-action movies. Sony's contract from the 90s was ironclad. But television? Television was a different story. Disney was launching a brand new cable network called Disney XD. They needed flagship shows. They looked at their newly acquired Marvel catalog and realized it was absolutely insane that the biggest superhero in the world was currently starring in a hit cartoon on a rival network. Disney executives marched into the boardroom and essentially said, "We want Spider-Man on our channel." What followed was a high-stakes corporate trade that essentially doomed our favorite show. Sony at this time was gearing up to reboot their movie universe with Andrew Garfield in The Amazing Spider-Man. But to make that movie, they needed a few concessions and timeline extensions from Marvel regarding the live-action rights. Disney saw their opening. They sat down with Sony and proposed a trade. "We will give you the live-action movie concessions you need if you give us back the television animation rights to Spider-Man." Sony, knowing that movies make billions of dollars while cartoons only make millions, agreed. They signed the paper. They handed the television rights back to Disney. Fans panicked. But then, a glimmer of hope. People thought, wait, if Disney has the TV rights and Disney wants a hit show for Disney XD, they can just take Spectacular Spider-Man, move it to their network, and fund Season 3 themselves. This is where the corporate autopsy gets grim, because that is where the legal trap snapped shut. Yes, Disney now owned the rights to make a Spider-Man cartoon, but remember Chapter 2. Sony produced Spectacular. Sony's Culver Entertainment owned the specific character designs. They owned the vocal tracks, the theme song, and the physical episodes of Seasons 1 and 2. It created the ultimate Mexican standoff. Sony legally could not make Season 3 because they had just traded the Spider-Man television rights to Disney. But Disney legally could not make Season 3 either, because if they continued the storyline of Spectacular Spider-Man, they would be using Sony's proprietary designs and Sony's continuity. Disney would have had to pay massive licensing fees to their direct rival, Sony, just to air the show on Disney XD. The show became a corporate hostage. Neither side could legally produce it without the other, and neither corporation was willing to split the profits. Greg Weisman and his team were forced to watch, paralyzed, as their 65-episode masterpiece was torn apart by a legal technicality. It wasn't canceled because of bad ratings. It wasn't canceled because kids didn't buy the toys. It was canceled because of a loophole. And instead of compromising to save a beloved piece of art, Disney decided to burn it all down and start from scratch. Disney is a master of brand synergy. When they bought Marvel, they didn't just want to tell good stories. They wanted a marketing machine. They looked at Spectacular Spider-Man and saw a problem. The show was too isolated. Greg Weisman had built a beautiful, self-contained universe, but Disney was building the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The Avengers movie was just around the corner in 2012. Disney needed a cartoon that would introduce kids to Nick Fury, S.H.I.E.L.D., and an interconnected roster of heroes. So in 2012, Disney XD premiered Ultimate Spider-Man. The tonal shift gave fans whiplash. Gone was the fluid kinetic animation of South Korea, replaced by a stiffer, flash-based style. Gone were the deep emotional arcs of Peter struggling to pay rent or balance his relationships. Instead, Peter Parker was immediately recruited by S.H.I.E.L.D., handed a high-tech flying motorcycle. The show constantly broke the fourth wall. Peter would freeze time, look at the camera, and make a goofy joke like he was starring in a superhero sitcom.
I'd advise against making another poor decision.
I've done a lot of good as Spider-Man, but I've also made life more dangerous for my Aunt May and everyone else close to me. How many people have I hurt by being Spider-Man? Now Ock and his Sinister Six...
Now, to be fair to Ultimate Spider-Man, it wasn't trying to be a prestige drama. It was aiming for a younger, wider demographic, and in that regard, it succeeded. But for fans of Spectacular, it felt like an insult. But if you want to know just how ruthless Disney's pursuit of brand synergy was, you have to look at what they did to Josh Keaton. Josh Keaton wasn't just the voice of Peter Parker.
By and allowing someone to suffer or die because you do nothing.
For an entire generation, he was Spider-Man. Even after Spectacular was caught in the Disney-Sony hostage situation and canceled, fans held out hope that they would at least get to hear Keaton voice the character in other Marvel projects. And for a brief moment, they did. Right around the time Ultimate Spider-Man was being developed, Marvel had another critically acclaimed cartoon airing called Avengers, Earth's Mightiest Heroes. In Season 2, The Avengers showrunners wrote an episode featuring Spider-Man, and they brought in Josh Keaton to voice him. Keaton went into the booth, he recorded his lines. The episode was fully animated, the audio was mixed, the episode was entirely finished and ready to air. And then, the Disney executives stepped in. Disney was about to launch Ultimate Spider-Man starring Drake Bell. The executives looked at the finished Avengers episode and decided that having Josh Keaton voice Spider-Man on the same network would confuse the brand. They wanted a unified corporate voice for the character across all media to sell the new show. So, Disney ordered the animation studio to scrap Josh Keaton's entirely finished performance. They brought Drake Bell into the recording booth, had him dub over Keaton's lines, and erased Josh Keaton from the episode entirely. It was a devastating slap in the face. Disney didn't just cancel Spectacular Spider-Man. They actively scrubbed its leading actor out of an entirely different show just to force Ultimate Spider-Man down the audience's throats. It was the ultimate proof that artistic continuity meant absolutely nothing in the face of corporate synergy. Here is the brutal truth of the corporate autopsy. Disney didn't care, because Ultimate Spider-Man was a financial juggernaut. By removing the complex, serialized storytelling, Disney made a show that could be aired in any order on Saturday mornings. Kids didn't need to watch Season 1 to understand Season 3. And more importantly, by stuffing the show with guest stars like Wolverine, Captain America, and Taskmaster, and giving Peter Shield tech like the Spider Cycle, Disney created an endless pipeline for new action figures. Spectacular Spider-Man was built to be a great television show. Ultimate Spider-Man was built to be a commercial. And in the eyes of the executives holding the spreadsheets, the commercial won. Ultimate ran for 4 seasons, totaling over 100 episodes, completely dwarfing Spectacular's run. So, what did we actually lose? What was supposed to happen in Season 3 and beyond? Because Greg Weisman is incredibly interactive with his fanbase, we actually know a lot about the lost roadmap. The master plan was always 65 episodes, culminating in Peter's high school graduation. Season 3 would have plunged Peter into total darkness. Harry Osborn was set to take up the glider, blaming Spider-Man for his father's supposed death. We were going to get the introduction of Scorpion, Mr. Negative, and Hobgoblin. Even crazier, Weisman had planned for direct-to-DVD animated movies to bridge the gaps between seasons. One of these movies was going to cover Peter and his classmates going to Florida for spring break. Sounds fun, right? Until you realize the villain for the spring break movie was going to be the Lizard, loose in the swamps of Florida. We were robbed of seeing Eddie Brock's ultimate redemption. We were robbed of Cletus Cassidy becoming Carnage in this stunning art style. For 14 years, the cast and crew considered the show dead and buried. The legal stalemate between Sony and Disney remained practically frozen in carbonite. But then, in 2023, a tiny miracle happened. In Sony's animated masterpiece, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Miguel O'Hara is walking through the headquarters of the Spider Society, and there, standing in the background, is the unmistakable, simplified design of the spectacular Spider-Man. But it wasn't just a visual cameo. Sony brought back Josh Keaton, the original voice of Peter Parker, to record a brand new line of dialogue. It was only a few seconds.
We know it's hard, but it's the truth, Miles.
It didn't undo the cancellation. It didn't magically greenlight Season 3. But for the fans and for the creators who poured their souls into those 26 episodes, it was an acknowledgement, a confirmation that this specific Peter Parker was still out there, swinging through his universe, surviving the corporate apocalypse that tried to erase him. The death of Spectacular Spider-Man remains one of the greatest tragedies in modern animation. It proves that no matter how perfect the art is, it is always at the mercy of the executives holding the checkbook. Sony's monopoly gave the show life, but Disney's multi-billion-dollar buyout built the legal trap that killed it. Thanks for watching this corporate autopsy. If you want to see more deep dives into the boardrooms that control your favorite media, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments which franchise we should autopsy next. Until then, keep an eye on the fine print.